Donald Trump's long-awaited tax bill passed the House with a small hiccup on Tuesday, December 19th, and then went on to the Senate on Wednesday, December 20th. It's the biggest tax overhaul in 30 years, and President Trump has called it a big, beautiful Christmas present for American taxpayers, although it's supposedly not going to be officially signed until January 3rd. How will the bill's change affect you, and when? These questions are especially important if you're actively saving for retirement, which is why we're going to be tackling them right here on today's show. So it is time once again to tune out the hype and focus on the facts. Facts that matter to you, the income generation. Let's get started. Get ready to separate reality from myth.
With us, David Scranton.
David Scranton. But David Scranton says, hey, not so fast.
How does it affect the markets? How does it affect the economy? Thanks to efficiencies in new technology and a staff of veteran analysts and portfolio managers, Sound Income Strategy strives to set new standards and bring institutional style investing to your portfolio. Hello everyone and welcome to The Income Generation. I am David Scranton, your host. When we first devoted a whole show to the Trump administration's proposed tax bill earlier this year, it was still just that, proposed. And soon it will be signed into law, even though it still has many critics. Here's how both sides of the argument play out. Critics claim that the plan benefits primarily the super wealthy at the expense of the poor and the middle class. They're skeptical that Republicans can pay for it through economic growth and without adding to the already mushrooming federal deficit. Supporters, however, point to record high levels in consumer confidence, stock market highs that began right after the election last November and continuing over the last year, and most recently tallied growth of just close to 3% GDP over the last few months, along with solid job reports, all indicating to Trump supporters that this concept of paying for it with growth may just not be a total pipe dream after all. So the question becomes, which should you believe? We'll look at these issues and more on today's show with a special focus on how the tax plan could impact you, working Americans, part of the income generation born before 1966, those who are retired or within 15 years of retirement. So join us once again to break it all down as one of the country's leading tax experts on taxes and tax policy. Of course, you already know because you just saw the picture who's our guest today. But if you're a regular viewer, or even if you were on the show last week, you would know. Why? Because last week I told you that our guest today is none other than Mr. Steve Forbes. But if you're a regular viewer, you also know because it's the only show, it's the only guest for whom I actually wear a necktie. And frankly, it's not because he's so famous or anything like that. It's because he's such a nice guy, and he got me this tie as a gift. And I'm kind of a sort of a sentimental fellow. So during the show today, we're also going to be sharing a short preview of my upcoming 2018 market forecast show, airing next week on New Year's Eve. But first, let's take a look at some of the key features of our new tax laws and guidelines and what they could both mean for you, both this tax season and beyond. And yes, just in time for Christmas, Republicans passed their massive tax reform, touting it as a gift to taxpayers and to economic growth. That sounds great, but when can you expect to see and feel the real effects of this gift? To be clear, it certainly won't be as soon as Christmas morning. The good news is there are finally a few other certainties, though, that we can discuss now that this tax plan is soon to be signed into law. And at the same time, there are a lot of lingering questions and unknowns. And we'll get into those also a little bit later in the show. But first, let's focus on answering some of the questions that now have been answered over just the last few weeks. So first of all, when will the new tax law start to take effect? For most, the earliest might be February of 2018. If you're currently working, the most noticeable change may be to your take-home pay. With lower tax rates, employers will take a little bit less money out of workers' paychecks, which means an increase in your take-home pay probably around February. It takes them a month or so to make their adjustments. Other impacts, however, won't start until you're working on your 2018 taxes, which is going to be close to April 2019. As you know, 2017 is really unaffected. It's based upon the old tax rules. So when you do your tax planning with your CPA before April of next year, 2018, nothing has really changed. One exception, though, that you're going to see that affects people immediately is that individuals without health insurance will not have to pay the Obamacare penalty this year for not being covered. That change does go into effect, as I mentioned, immediately as the individual mandate has been repealed. That's one aspect of Obamacare that President Trump was able to complete his promise to the Americans about getting rid of that mandate. Unfortunately, of course, you're watching the news earlier this year, you're aware that the full repeal of Obamacare did not happen. And unfortunately, that was not able to get through Congress. Now, on the other hand, what you're going to see, and I'm going to talk to Steve about this a little bit and ask his opinion, he may find that what's really happened is kind of a backdoor way to kind of sort of unravel Obamacare. So we'll have that conversation in just a bit. Now, here's some good news. We have all new tax brackets that should provide tax relief for many Americans. So what are the new brackets? Well, the new law maintains 7 individual brackets at slightly different rates. So the old 10 and 15% bracket has really now become the 10 and 12% bracket. The old 25% bracket, where many Americans sat, has now become the 22 and 24%. All the higher brackets have now been compressed somewhat into the 32, 35, and 37% brackets. Now, yes, this is different from the 4-bracket system that President Trump originally proposed. Our guest Steve Forbes will give us some more insight into that change in just a minute. So how about the standard deduction? Well, it's essentially doubling from $6,350 to $12,000 for individuals and from $12,700 to $24,000 for married couples filing jointly. And that is a change that will have some impact on taxpayer decisions about whether to itemize or not. Unfortunately, because they're also getting rid of the personal exemptions, that increased benefit might not be as big of a deal as many people think on the surface. Now, how about state and local taxes? What's the story with those? Are those still deductible? Well, the answer is yes, sort of. Why? Because there are new limits. Filers can deduct up to $10,000 in state and local taxes. And also, you kind of have to choose now whether it's state and local income taxes or property taxes or sales tax. That's an important change from earlier drafts of the plan, which called for a complete repeal of state and local deductions. How are homeowners going to be affected? Well, with the exception of the property tax limits, mortgage interest deductions do not change for homeowners with existing mortgages. However, if you're going to be buying a house under the new tax law, that's starting January 1st, 2018, the most that you can deduct in terms of interest on mortgage debt is now $750,000, whereas in the past it was $1 million. How about charitable donations? Well, fortunately, those deductions for charitable donations has not changed under the new tax law. That means that if you itemize, you may still be able to deduct charitable donations made to qualifying organizations. In fact, up to a limit of 50% of your adjusted gross income for most income tax payers. And finally, if I had a drum set here, I'd do a drum roll. Actually, I wouldn't because I don't know how to play the drums. The question becomes, what kind of tax break are businesses getting? Well, the new law slashes the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That's 1% higher than the 20% originally proposed, but it's still an enormous tax cut for businesses. In addition, the tax burden has been lowered for pass-through for businesses. That affects owners of S corporations, LLCs, partnerships, who take their income in the form of profit distribution rather than salary. That's known as pass-through income and is taxed currently at personal income tax rates. Under the new law, however, you'll be able to deduct the first 20% of that pass-through income as being tax-free. Now, that doesn't apply to certain personal service organizations, doctors, lawyers, and the such, whose income is over a certain threshold. Additionally, employers are going to be able to eliminate expenditures and be able to, instead of amortizing write-offs over the course of so many years when they buy new capital equipment, they're actually going to be able to do 100% upfront expensing of some capital equipment as opposed to depreciation. Theoretically, at least, that should provide incentives for business owners to invest more in capital equipment and therefore stimulate the economy. So theoretically, at least, in terms of the big picture, whether you realize it or not, these last items that affect businesses are supposed to be the most important parts of the tax plan. Why? Because what they do is first of all, they're really the secret sauce in President Trump's entire plan. It's what supporters maintain will allow the plan to pay for itself through economic growth, because businesses large and small will be paying a lower percentage in taxes. That smaller percentage will presumably be paid on a massively higher amount of corporate profits, which will ultimately mean an increase in government revenue with less burden on individual taxpayers. Now, we've already seen some GDP growth this year due to a lot of the deregulation that President Trump has been able to do after the Obama administration. Some of the increase in regulations that have come into play have now been reversed. And that alone is part of the GDP growth we've seen as of late. And it's obvious that Wall Street's pretty optimistic that the new tax rate's going to increase the momentum and deliver that type of sustained GDP growth that President Trump claims it will. In fact, a week ago, on the eve of the tax plan's final approval, the stock market hit yet another all-time high. Now, regular viewers know that I've discussed a lot about the relationship between the stock market and the Trump tax plan, pointing out that market performance since his election has been driven largely by optimism about that plan. That means not only optimism that the plan would be approved, but that it would also be able to deliver the kind of long-term economic growth that the president says it will. Enough growth to finally give the overinflated markets fundamental support. The question becomes, will it happen? And moreover, what are the potential consequences if it doesn't? We'll talk more about that later in the show. But right now, let's get on with some insights on the new tax laws and what they mean for you from one of the nation's leading sources of the subject and one of our favorite guests, Steve Forbes. Steve is the editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine and a leading authority on business, the economy, and yes, especially taxes. He's the author of several books, including Reviving America, How Repealing Obamacare, Replacing the Tax Code, and Reforming the Fed Will Restore Hope and Prosperity. Steve has been with us several times now, including 2 on the previous shows that we've had about the tax plan. So Steve, welcome.
Good to be back. Thank you, David.
Now we have to, can we make some arrangements here, please, in terms of, an agreement we have between us, please, for the show? I need to make an arrangement here. See, I have to tell you a secret.
Well, you pay me so much, and with this new tax plan, I don't have to pay income tax on it, so yeah, we can cut a deal. Free water.
That was exactly what I was thinking about, but always the quintessential businessman. That's what I love about you. No, see, I have to confess. We're recording the show a couple days before, and as a result, I have to confess I haven't reviewed the entire tax plan. So you have to do me a favor and not say anything that makes me look silly or foolish about the tax plan. Is that fair? Can you do that for me?
Yes, and I'm surprised a man of your ability couldn't read through 600 pages of gibberish and comprehend what they've slipped in. Yes, months. Tax lawyers. What tax lawyer told me the other day, he said we're all going back to school.
We are.
A whole new set of things are going to have to learn.
This is going to be a weekend read for me, that's for sure. Now, on the other hand, if you want to call me to the carpet because maybe I have a wild eyebrow or something like that that's showing up on the camera, that's okay, but not the taxes. Fair enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
we have to take a quick commercial break, and then we come.
How many members of Congress have read it?
Zero. Oh my goodness, can you believe that? Wow. Stay with us. We're going to be back with our interview with Steve Forbes. As we've discussed many times in the show and earlier today, the stock market's been riding high ever since President Trump's inauguration. In fact, over 70 record-setting days in the markets this year. First, on the shaky promise of the repeal of Obamacare, which of course didn't work out. And then more recently, the markets have been riding high with the anticipation of President Trump's tax reform plan, which to both critics and supporters alike looks like it will indeed become the first legislative promise that President Trump has been able to be 100% successful in delivering to the American people. But once it is signed into law, the question becomes, what then needs to happen next in order to sustain the overvalued equity market? Or should you alternatively begin to think about what your next move should be if there is a substantial correction in 2018? I guess ultimately it depends upon which side of the fence that you sit on. The answer, according to some, is pretty much just what President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors predicted will happen in an October report. They said that the corporate tax cut, along with the immediate expensing of capital investments, will boost long-term GDP growth by between 3 and 5%. or I should say really up to 3 and 5%. They predicted those effects could kick in as quickly as 3 to 5 years, adding that there will be additional GDP effects from reforms to individual income and pass-through business taxes, which we have not yet modeled, as well as growth from regulatory reform, as well as an infrastructure package. Along with this report, CEA Chairman Kevin Hassett said that at the time he was optimistic the corporate tax cuts would generate enough growth to pay for all the tax cuts proposed within the plan. And now that the plan is going to be the law, of course, we'll have to see. But a lot of economists aren't as optimistic as Wall Street or the Trump administration. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that the tax plan will indeed increase federal deficits by as much as $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years. A more comprehensive 2014 study by the Brookings Institution found that tax reform's net impact on GDP growth in general are either always small or slightly negative. Other economists have pointed out that with the economy already improving, massive tax cuts designed to turbocharge that growth could actually backfire. As Federal Reserve Bank President William Dudley put it, "I'm not in favor of tax stimulus at the current time because the economy doesn't really need it." But the secret that many politicians and corporate heads understand is that in many ways, the economy, or at least the stock market, really does need it in order to, again, try to give the market actual fundamental support based upon today's actual values and market prices. Again, ever since the election, the markets have been growing and have been outpacing actual economic growth by a pretty significant margin. The markets have soared by over 20% in the past year, while GDP growth is on a pace to hit just about maybe 3% or so annualized over the last 2 quarters. That's certainly an improvement over 1.6% for all of 2016, but it's hardly enough to justify record high stock market levels. In fact, that's why the economy actually does need turbocharging in some ways, or a shot of rocket fuel, as President Trump has called his tax plan. It's needed in order to actually improve corporate profits and get them to finally catch up to these overvalued stock prices. It's also true because the stock market hasn't made fundamental sense if you think about it. Basically, for the last 10 years, that's when the Federal Reserve began its own turbocharging efforts with quantitative easing and all these other radical forms, many of them untested previously, radical forms of artificial stimulus. The markets have basically been addicted to this artificial stimulus and artificial factors ever since, over the last decade or so. Investors have enjoyed some impressive looking growth throughout this addiction period for sure. But what you may or may not realize is that the actual average return that many stock market investors have had, buy and hold, since the turn of the century, hasn't been any greater than many fixed income investors. So how is that possible? Well, it's possible because total return, as you know, is a sum of not just growth, but really growth plus income. Investors focusing on the latter instead of the former, that is income instead of growth, have less risk of a major loss that can significantly impact their average return over time. In fact, over the last 17 years, we have a perfect example playing out. Since 2000, the stock market has risen some 60%, but it's also experienced 2 major drops in the middle, one during the bursting of the tech bubble and the other during the financial crisis. And because of that, buy and hold investors during that time have achieved an average of only about 3% annualized growth. When you throw in dividends, it's an average total return of about 5% per year. By comparison, many fixed income-based investors whose portfolios have been properly managed have been able to achieve that 5% or more in just income. And when you factor in growth, many of them have actually outperformed their stock market counterparts. And they've done it with far less risk of a major loss during those 2 major market drops, and without the continued risk of a 3rd major stock market drop. Which brings us back to our topic today, which is President Trump's corporate tax cuts. It's certainly possible, yes, that they will have exactly the desired effect and add rocket fuel to a fire that's already flickering, with apparently a lot of promise, or so the stock market says. And it's possible that for the coming year, the markets will respond by hovering at their current peaks and maybe even go higher. But remember this about rocket fuel. It burns fast and hot, and then it ultimately burns out. Remember, too, that eventually, one way or another, the financial markets have to make fundamental mathematical sense once again. They have to align with economic realities. So, coming up in just a bit, we're going to talk more about my stock market tease for next year, as I've teased up last week for you. But right now, let's get back to talking to my good friend and tax authority, Steve Forbes, about the Trump administration's newly approved Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So, Steve, you wrote a paper recently entitled How Republicans Forgot Tax Cutting 101.
Yes, in a couple of major ways. One is what economists call marginal tax rates. That is the tax rate you pay on the next additional dollar of income. That really stimulates or affects behavior, whether you invest, whether you spend, and not just your average rate, but what it's going to do if you earn an extra $5,000 or $10,000. If you have to pay it all over to the government, you're not going to bother to earn it. The Republicans forgot that. Near the end of this hideous tax process, they began to remember it. So on the personal side, they started to make some cuts, not big ones, but started to move it in the right direction. It's on the business side that they really got it right, reducing, as you pointed out, 35 to 21. Pass-throughs they've made hopelessly complicated, but it looks like they've knocked 10 points off of that, from 39.6 to 29.6. We'll see how it actually shakes out, but it's a good cut if that holds through. So on the investment side, it's critical. We've had, as you know, subpar investment for a decade. And so in order to get a higher standard of living, we need more investment. Sure. And that leads not just to enabling people to keep more of what they earn now, but have higher earnings, higher salaries, higher pay in the future. And you have to have investment. So they are laying the foundations for good long-term growth on the business side. And one of the things they should emphasize, David, in the new year, this tax bill is a down payment of more tax cuts to come. Get the animal spirits really going. We're going to have more of this good stuff. We're going to do more for individuals. And that way, not only will you have good things here, but overseas, capital will be coming in.
Right. Now, animal spirits, of course, are going in the stock market right now. They seem to be going. But the question becomes really, do you really think that being able to take 100% deduction up front, not have to take depreciation over a life expectancy of an asset, how much is that really going to help stimulate the economy? President Obama did that for a short period of time, and it really didn't seem to do much back during the financial crisis. Is it that now it seems to be locked in for 5 years, so now businesses can plan? Do you think it'll make a difference?
With President Obama, if he gave you something, you knew he'd take it away at the first opportunity. And each day that administration was getting up and trying to figure out how to make life miserable for business people. This is a different environment, different psychology. And for smaller businesses, being able to write off the truck, the software and the like, that makes a difference. Big companies, not so much. But for smaller companies, which have had a really tough time in the last decade, this is really manna from heaven.
So I think what you're saying is finally now business owners, large and small, can have the confidence, which they didn't have during the Obama administration, the confidence to make good long-term business decisions and take advantage of those tax breaks. So we're going to take another break right now. Stay with us. We'll be back with more from my friend and tax expert, Steve Forbes. Welcome back. I'm here with my friend and tax expert, Steve Forbes. Now, I know what you're talking about with the marginal tax concept. And what you're basically saying is it provides a disincentive for people to work and grow because they think, well, gosh, if I get pushed into the next tax bracket, maybe it's not worth all the effort. And I've heard that many times from people, even from financial advisors who don't want to grow their practice as much because they're worried about that, as strange as that may seem. And I know you're a big proponent of the flat tax, but come on. Did you really think in today's political environment that we'd be able to get a flat tax or anything that resembles that through Congress?
The only way you're going to get a flat tax, and 40 countries and jurisdictions around the world in recent years have put it in, and it's worked very well everywhere it's been tried, is if it's pushed by the president. President Trump indicated a little over a year ago that when he gets this tax bill through, which has now happened, he's going to be open to a big radical change like a flat tax in the next 2 or 3 years. Remember, Ronald Reagan had a big tax cut in 1981. Then 5 years later, they cleaned the code of a lot of tax shelters and the like, cut the top rate from 50% down to 28%, passed the Senate 97-3. So I'm hoping that we're going to really do the big job in the next few years. I think this president wants to make a mark on history, isn't shy about it, and so I think he'll be more open to it than Congress. What happened in the last few days before this bill was finally approved is the Senate side woke up to the importance of lowering those tax brackets. And so they, even though they have 7 brackets instead of the 4 that the House originally had, those 7 are better for individuals. Yeah. People making $200,000, $300,000 a year, their marginal tax rates went down. So for the most part, they started to move in the right direction. So they began to understand it, which is progress in this world.
So you really do believe that this is a first step, and there should be more tax reform coming, and I hope you're right. The thing that worries me.
One of the things is, don't call it tax reform. That doesn't say anything to people. Call it tax cuts. You notice Trump, and finally the Congress started to take up on it. He says tax cuts, tax reform. He gets it. People understand cuts. Reform, what are you talking about?
Why sugarcoat it? It doesn't help. Yeah, and I hope you're right. I just hope that he actually runs for re-election, and with all the pushback from the Democrats, he may just be too smart of a fellow to say, you know what, one and done. I've had enough. So hopefully you're right. But
well, if he decides to run for re-election, just as an aside, the Democrats have to run somebody against him, and that makes this whole calculus very different. It's one thing to say, well, I really don't like that guy, but who are they putting up?
Right, that's right, that's right. That's great. And you and I both agree that the biggest impact here is going to be for businesses. And that's huge, whether it's publicly traded companies that go from 35% to 21%, which, by the way, if you go from 35% to 21% marginal brackets as a corporation, that means your net profits can increase by as much as 22%, which, by the way, probably justifies the 22% growth we've seen in the stock market since Election Day.
Yeah, the market was anticipating this. If this bill had faltered, you'd have seen several thousand points go off overnight.
I absolutely. Now, that's businesses. We all agree that's great. So now how about, forgetting trickle down for a minute and everything, let's just talk about individuals. Which part of that segment is best going to benefit from this? Is it more low-income individuals, high-income individuals? Is it the middle? And who's going to benefit the least, in your opinion?
Well, lower and middle income earners do get some cuts in their tax rates. They may benefit from this doubling of the personal exemption, although the Republicans typically made it more complicated than they need have done so. But if you start to earn more money, they did widen the thresholds, the brackets, and so that's pretty good. But the real people who generate capital for investment, especially if you live in a blue state, initially you're going to take a real hit. And one of the things they should have considered was phasing in the phasing out the state and local deductions. So that would put pressure on states to lower their rates, give them time to do it.
Give them time, sure.
And people to adjust to it. But so they did it overnight. So those folks, capital creation is not going to be on the individual side as robust as it would have been. But that, again, is why they should say, this is just a beginning. We're going to take another whack at it. And on the so-called pass-throughs, which you're familiar with, I'm familiar with, what they should have done, and I hope they do next time, is just lower the top bracket from 39, 30, now it's 37%, lower it to 25%, so you don't get in. Are you a personal business? Are you this? Are you that? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Which is a tax lawyer bonanza. I have nothing against tax lawyers, but I think the less work they have, the better off we are.
Well, kind of sort of treat it like the corporate brackets themselves and make it simple, is what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's interesting because I believe, that retirees, unfortunately, could have been benefited more, but they didn't, because that 3.8% Obamacare tax that they were hoping to repeal didn't get repealed. So that's unfortunate. But it seems to me as though the lowest income earners could benefit, because that 15%, 10 and 15 got dropped to 10 and 12. And the highest income earners could benefit because the 39.6 got dropped to 37. It seems to me there's a bracket in the middle, roughly 4 to 500, 4 to 600, that might go from 28 up to 32, that might be quite as clean. Have you thought about that at all? Or
there is a small point between, talking about couples, between 400,000 and I think it was 418,000, don't hold me to it, but where your marginal bracket actually went up a little bit. But thanks to the senators finally realizing about marginal tax rates, which Ronald Reagan understood, Jack Kemp understood, Calvin Coolidge understood, John Kennedy understood, they did reduce some of those rates, which the House did not understand. So a bill that could have been a real disaster on the personal side, could have been better, but it does not do real harm. And the harm that it does do, I think there'll be a real impetus. Let's clean it up next time.
Certainly. Well, you know, you've given me, the one thing I love about our conversation today, amongst many, but the one thing is that I guess I hadn't thought about this as a stepping stone quite as much. And you've got me to think about the stepping stone factor. And as his popularity grows, the ability to do other things.
One of the things that was amazing they didn't do this time is they didn't reduce the capital gains levy, which you've made reference to, because that instantly means more revenue.
Okay,
Every time
so here's what I want you to
rate,
do.
And it also incentivizes you to invest more.
Tell our viewers, though, about why a capital gains cut is not just a tax cut for the wealthy, like the Democrats like to believe.
Well, everyone has a 401k or some kind of retirement plan. And when we reduce the capital gains levy, that gives a real firm basis to an increasing the assets of your 401k, your IRA or Roth IRA. It also gives people more incentive to invest, to create the new products, new services, and the jobs that have higher income. So you just don't keep more of what you're currently earning, but your pay starts to go up in a meaningful way. So you get a good double bang. You keep more of what you earn, but you're going to be earning more. So you have lower taxes on the higher earnings. That's better for everybody. And every time we reduce the capital gains tax levy, the economy has benefited from it. There's been more investment, and the government gets more money. So it's win-win. It's good for the economy. You have instant revenue for the government, so you don't get caught up on, we need pay-fors for these tax cuts, which is crazy anyway. So it's good. It's good, David, that we get away from this thing and get a real capital gains tax cut and not let the Democrats define the terms of debate.
Well, and not only that, but as you wrote about in your paper, you said, and I thought this was profound, was that, you know, by getting a tax cut today, people will take advantage of that and sell capital assets and realize the gain. So we'll get more tax revenue today into the government coffers, which can actually then make it somewhat revenue positive up front for the government. Yeah. So now they can take that extra money and use it to be able to do other tax cuts for your average American.
And in the early 80s, when we cut the rate from 20 to 15, CBO and others said it would have about $200 billion of revenue in the next few years. Revenue came in at over $350 billion. They always underestimate the immediate revenue that comes in. So next time, I hope they get that one right.
So it's funny because in your paper you implied that the Democrats kind of sort of, or the Republicans kind of sort of kowtowed to the Democrats. But in reality, what you're saying is, if they're coming back again to get a second bite of the apple, it could very well be the old verbiage of being dumb as a fox. And so I hope you're right. Hang with us for just a few more minutes, please. Okay. When we come back, we're going to have some fun here. I'm going to put Steve on the spot. I'm going to ask him about what he thinks the economic forecast is likely to be for 2018. And then we're also going to talk about some of the comments that maybe he's heard on some other news shows that he's been on, maybe some of those stations that are a little bit more liberal than Newsmax. We'll be right back. Stay with us. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. We'll see you all next Sunday. All right, welcome back. Let's talk more taxes. Steve, you know, we had talked off camera just a little bit about how, in some ways, the doubling of the standard deduction is a little bit of smoke and mirrors because they also got rid of the personal exemption. So some families might end up a little bit ahead, and some families might end up a little bit behind. But perhaps the biggest effect that is going to affect families, especially in states like where we are, right? You live in New Jersey. I live part-time in Connecticut. I have business interests in Connecticut. The only thing that could be worse from a tax perspective, perhaps, if we lived in California, right? So you know, how is it going to affect those states? You know, there was no phase-in. The states didn't have a chance to prepare. You know, I'm concerned about not a mass exodus, but I'm concerned about people saying, now, if I can't deduct all of these property taxes or state and local income taxes on my federal return, and I have to pay that much more, then I'm leaving. But are you concerned about that too?
Yeah, it's going to have an impact on property taxes, which will impact property tax revenue in those states. Some people are going to make the move. You live in New Jersey, for example. Even if you go to Pennsylvania, your top rate will go from 9% to 3+%. So you're going to see movement from people, which is going to hurt their revenues. So the states are going to have to start to get their own acts together in terms of taxes. The Republicans are smart. They'll have candidates next year running for governors in many of those blue states making that point.
Sure.
We've got to lower the tax burden. But it was an unnecessary thing. They could have phased it in. They could have done it in a way by reducing rates more. You know, back in 1986 when they cut the top rate from 50 to 28, they didn't wipe out all the other deductions. They took some away, but states still reduced their taxes. New York State, under Mario Cuomo, liberal governor, reduced the top state income tax rate. So there was a better way to do it. I wish they had done it because it would have been good for the economy and it would have been better politically for the Republicans.
Well, the word liberal meant something a little different in the 1980s from what it means today. So speaking of today, let's talk about your economic forecast for this year. You know, I know this is just a stepping stone in your mind for the next tax cut that the Trump administration could hopefully engineer. But that won't be in 2018. So what do you think this is going to do economically for 2018?
What it does is I think it'll solidify a 3.5% growth economy. As you know, for a decade, it's been under 2%. Yeah, we had a few quarters that would go above it, but we were going 25 miles an hour in a zone and a 70-mile-an-hour zone speed zone. Now we're going to get it up to 40, 45. Good start. And if the administration continues, Trump continues on deregulation and the like, good. The things, what could go wrong? A foreign crisis. A trade war would be devastating. He's got to do that right. So there are always things lurking out there, but they at least got the tax thing on the business side right. And if they make it clear there's more to come, I think we'll have the best year since really the middle part of the last decade. And that'll start to change people's attitudes. Hey, this first meal was good. Let's have another one.
That's great. And I'm not sure how much corporate spending on infrastructure, now they've got that first year write-off, I'm not sure how much that's going to happen in 2018 because it's not a 1 or 2 year thing. But you're right, just the fact that the economy can grow faster. If you're right, and I have no reason to think you're not, but we can get that up consistently over 3.5%, that should have positive effects.
And if the attitude is, you know, investment takes time, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years to pay off. Drugs, you know, for 12, 15 years.
Right.
But the key thing is if people sense that plans are being made, that they're going to, CapEx is going to go up on a sustained basis, that starts to change attitudes. And you're also going to see something that's going to be tough on CEOs, labor shortages. They're going to have to train workers more. And that means is higher wages, and Fed will say, the Federal Reserve, oh, this is overheating the economy. No such thing. Let it play out. And people have a feeling we haven't had since the late 1990s.
It's the confidence, it's the C word, which is wonderful. So now I want to have some fun. You see, you're on all different networks, and I kind of live in a little bit of a cocoon here at Newsmax. So you get on some of these networks that are perhaps just a little bit more liberal than Newsmax. So in our last minute or so, tell me, what are they saying? You know, what are the critics saying now about that's making all these news headlines about President Trump?
They're saying the world's going to come to an end. No meteors have been sighted, so they're going to have to backtrack on that. But this is where the president's got to figure out. He's got solid achievements in the first year. How does he take himself out of it so people can say, hey, this guy rose to the occasion despite all the things we might not have liked about him? So the skeptics will start to say, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. And so if he picks his fights more carefully, I think he can start to cash in on what the economy is going to do, what the market has already done. So people focus on the achievements, and that'll benefit him and set him up for 2020.
You know, it's funny, I have a feeling that, you know, we had the art of the deal, we had the art of the comeback, and I think before the 4-year period is done, we're going to have another book entitled The Art of Getting Things Through Congress. I hope and pray that he's going to figure it out. Steve, thanks so much once again for being on our show. It's been my pleasure. You too. Happy New Year. Thanks. So next, it's not your imagination. It's not a rerun. Yes, once again, I'm going to be shamelessly teasing my 2018 market forecast. Why? Because I feel it's going to be an especially valuable and eye-opening show. And I really, really want to encourage you to tune in. Let's face it, no economist or market analyst has a crystal ball. However, forecasting the year ahead is a key part of the job for any economist or advisor whose first priority is to help his or her clients protect their money. Last week, I shared some of the details I'll be examining as I put together my market forecast for 2018. And once again, those include the Federal Reserve and its ongoing efforts to raise short-term interest rates without flattening the yield curve. Donald Trump's tax plan, of course, which we're taking a close look at on today's show. President Trump's entire presidency and whether or not his economic goals can be sabotaged by other policies and actions. And of course, let's not forget the global picture. Just like here at home, it's a messy mix of economic promise and socio-political turmoil. Now, in addition to all that, we'll be focusing on what you need to know to keep an eye on regarding the bond market. As I pointed out many times, one indicator that Wall Street's optimism has been guarded since President Trump's election is indeed the bond market. It's often said that the bond market is smarter than the stock market, at least its investors and participants are, so they say. But the bond market has not dropped proportionally with the stock market's rise. This would normally be the case with the stock market, supported by fundamentals rather than hope and hype. The 10-year Treasury bond, for example, its rate hasn't surpassed 2.5% since March. This is not only the crux of the Federal Reserve's yield curve dilemma, but it's also a telling sign about the true strength of the sky-high stock market. I'll also talk more about a topic I touched upon today, and that is the significance of income when it comes to total return. Even if the stock market continues to cling to its lofty heights in the coming year, the question becomes, what does that mean in terms of actual average return for investors with substantial market risk, compared to those that are more conservative, focusing on income instead of growth? So joining me to talk about all this next week and much more will be economist Peter Morici. He'll be piped in from our Washington, D.C. studio. He's a contributor and a frequent guest to many, if not all, the networks, including, yes, right here at Newsmax. Peter will share in my forecast next week and might even surprise us just a bit about his own forecast concerning the economy and also the world inside the beltway. So, what can you do about it? Simple. If you're close to retirement and you really, really want to know how to protect and maximize your money, it's absolutely essential that you stay informed and up to date. And as always, you can catch up on any shows you've missed at www.theincomegeneration.com. So until next week, I'm David Scranton, your host. If you're over age 50, this is where you can find the answers to your financial questions right here on The Income Generation. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. We'll see you all next Sunday.
When it comes to investing, you always hear that past performance is no guarantee of future success. Yet many investors ignore that mantra and so often make three very common mistakes.
First mistake is chasing returns. This is commonly referred to as rearview mirror investing. This is like driving down the highway only looking in your rearview mirror, and we know how dangerous that can be. Second mistake is trying to time the markets. There's a baseball Hall of Fame, there's a rock and roll Hall of Fame, but the market timing Hall of Fame is an empty room. And the third mistake, most common, is chasing yield. This should be the most conservative aspect of your portfolio, but when you chase yield, you tend to take on more risk than you bargained for.
So don't fall victim to those mistakes. Talk to a financial advisor and have a strategy so that when you find that next gem, make sure not to get in too late or exit too soon. I'm Karina Brez.
Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Read Return on Principle, 7 core values to help protect your money in good times and bad. Available now.
If you're not using someone who's well trained in fixed income and you're born before 1966, it may just be time for you to break up with that advisor and move on. I would suggest someone who will care for you through these important years of your life. If you need help finding someone, call or write us. I'd also like to remind you of the special report entitled The Income Generation. This is available free to you, our loyal viewers, online. If you haven't downloaded your report, pick it up after the show. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. We'll see you all next Sunday.